As the title here suggests, I'll be talking about communication in science. I am a professor at the Merage School of Business. I received my PhD just south of here at NYU, but I also have a master's degree in social work. When I left Stanford, I was really interested in doing community work and thinking about how I could use my clinical skills in a more one-on-one group therapy sort of way, and ended up doing a lot of work with teams and families clinically as well. So in some ways what you're hearing is a mixture of what I know about from management of teams, meeting the soft skills of group therapy and group facilitation. So hopefully with both of those things in mind, I'll be able to answer some of your questions. More relatedly, over the last 10 years, I spent a lot of time thinking about and observing and studying research teams. It is my primary focus of research. So I'm the director of team science for this clinical translational science award, both at UCLA and UC Irvine. So I just taught a class at Cedars-Sinai in the middle of Los Angeles. I do a lot of work at UC Irvine Health. We just built a new team steps to train all of the teams at UC Irvine, and continue to work a lot coaching research faculty who are taking on things like centers and just wanting to see more productivity out of their labs. So first of all, I want to talk to you about whether or not this teaming business is here to stay. And here's some data from Wookdi et al. Out of Northwestern, which essentially shows that in every single field, the production of knowledge, papers, patents, etc., is increasingly happening in teams. If you look, the only flat line there is the humanities, where painting and writing a novel is still largely a solo endeavor. And so in some ways this speaks to the fact that sometimes our promotion and tenure systems on some level are no longer as relevant as they used to be, right? The sole scientist tinkering away at the bench, producing some novel insight is really an obsolete way of thinking about our work, right? The scientific endeavor is collaborative and it involves working with a lot of different people. When we work in teams, it is more likely that we're going to see higher impact work and that the citations are going to be much higher as well. So related to this, when we think about, well, why do we see this increase in people coming together across disciplines, across specializations? And I want to show you this, essentially this metaphor in a way of what we would call the growing burden of knowledge. Here you have the Wright brothers and their flying machine in 1903, right? Two individuals who do not have any specialized degree, and they've built this flying contraption. Fast forward to 2013, I live right across the street from the Boeing company. So I have this picture here of the Boeing Dreamliner 787, in which it took 30 different disciplines just to build the engine, right? And so much of this is that you can say, well, I'm a cardiologist, but I'm a cardiologist who specializes in this cell, in this region, doing this particular kind of work, right? So our specialized knowledge has become so narrow that in order for us to work on a problem, we need to come together with other people in some way. And so we have this increased specialization and the burden of having to bridge what I know with what you know with what they know. And here we end up with this challenge of going, well, how do we work across these boundaries? So what's really exciting when we think about teaming, right? And this can be, again, teaming in a clinical sense, teaming in a research sense, teaming in the general sense of advancement of science, is that we've seen some spectacular breakthroughs, ranging from manned spaceflight, the mapping of human DNA. At UC San Diego, I've worked with a team that's been looking at Kawasaki's disease. And I like to bring this one up because teaming also allows us to work on rare diseases, where in our home institution, you might see a handful of cases of children suffering from this particular disease. But when working on a team, and now with the internet and technology, we're able to couple data that's geographically distant and difficult to attain, and work together on such problems. So despite that potential of working together, we do know from 50 years of research, and this is one particular study by Cummings and Kiesler, that we are not very good at working across disciplines, across universities, across specializations. So here's a chart. This was a study done of 500 NSF funded project teams, where they looked at these teams that varied in their heterogeneity in the extent to which they had different universities and different disciplines represented. And then they looked at the number of outcomes, right? Their productivity in terms of creating patents, papers, etc. And what you'll see is this really discouraging negative slope, right? Essentially, the more disciplines and the more universities, the less likely these teams were to team effectively, right? Why do you think this is the case? Any thoughts? Are anyone surprised by this? Because all the federal agencies from NCI, NSF, right, NIH, they're saying, look, we want to see you have a co-investigator. We want to see you bridging across some difference. Go ahead, in the back. Excellent. Exactly, right? Exactly. And especially as we're seeing more and more participation of people like the citizen scientists, right? In LA, right? This can be things like we have community members in South Central and East LA who we put on our research teams who are critical to getting clinical samples, right? And participation in different work. And you're going, wow, how are they going to understand the research method or what it means to have a particular sample size or the requirements for IRB? And even within academia, right, we can see real barriers to communication. What's interesting about this that I want to bring up is that we know that things like figuring out how to distribute responsibility, how to manage meetings, how to think about how to transfer knowledge from one lab to another or from one person to another. When we think about simple things like how do we communicate and set up plans for publications and for coordination, the number of the very few teams in the scientific medical endeavor have ever received team training. So despite this negative slope, right, often even in medical school, how often did you work in a team on a project? Not too often. So it's a sort of thing like you graduate and all of a sudden you're being asked in your first R01 application or your application as a case scholar or even later on to create a management plan. Now, all NIH, NCR are actually asking for a team science component when you submit for funding, right? So all of this suggests they want to know how are you going to address this negative slope in your research team? And I'm hoping that I can uncover some of this challenge. So the very first thing I wanted to do was ask to have let's go with 6 volunteers. And if I could have you stand up here in the front, I'd like to show you something. Can I get 5 people to just come up here? One, two, three. Girl power. Girl power. All right, we'll see if we have a gender effect here. All right, if I can have them stand here. So what I'm going to ask them to do is to line up in order of their birth date without talking. And I'll give you, let's say, 30 seconds to do so. Okay? I'm not going to communicate as a team, but get in order, chronological order of your birth date. Okay? Go ahead.
And we're not supposed to talk among ourselves?
Talk verbally. All right, let's see how you did. Okay, when is your birthday?
February 6th.
February 6th.
March 6th. March 13th.
August 23rd. September 14th. Oh, they actually did it. Very, very good.
We're unsure about the year. I think that's
right.
At the end, and I didn't know why I did
that. I did it the second time. All right, so what is the very first thing that they did to communicate this information?
Stared at each other.
That's for sure. What they use first? The hands, right? So when somebody said, let's try this to communicate, right? And then what? Everybody else followed in an instant, right? How many of you are international? Anybody here from another country, right? So often when I do this in my MBA courses, which mine are about 45% international, someone puts the month instead of the date, right? Those are often flipped, right? Next thing you know, someone is way off and it doesn't work out the way you would. And so this use of this number digit approach is the very first norm set. And very quickly the norm takes off. And that's their rule of communication, right? And then we have each, you guys were both in March, right? Right, where you're trying to figure out, well, who goes first and what's going on, right? And there can often be some challenges there as everyone's trying to figure out, well, are we talking, dates or days or months or what's going on, right? But initially, when we come together, you guys can go ahead and sit down. Thank you very much. Round of applause to you guys. So initially, when we come together in teams, a norm forms very fast, right? And these can be norms like, oh, this PI is busy. You better not speak up too much because they want out in 30 minutes. They have a plan. You just sit and take a note, and right? And you can see the Bryson teams where the norm can be you put your cell phone on your desk, and it's okay to text. It's okay to answer your page. It's okay to have your computer open and be doing something else while everybody's meeting. There are other team settings where you walk in and the norm is very clear. You're to put that away. You're supposed to be, the meeting's going to start right on time. And you know that everyone, you're going to hear from everyone, right? But very quickly, this understanding, implicit understanding of how are we going to work here forms. And it completely sets the trajectory of your dynamic. And in fact, sometimes when you take the very first what pops up without thinking about, but is it working? Is it the right approach? You end up going down a path that's not optimal. But in any case, much of what I'm going to talk about today is how those norms, when they're set, we want to set the right ones. And we do have, again, the science of team science to tell us what should those norms be. When we think about communication in science, often one of the biggest challenges is miscommunication or misinterpretation, right? This is a sort of thing where you think everyone has agreed, but someone really does have a better idea or they have an alternative suggestion, but they are not saying it. Why? Because they are an assistant professor, because they are just the lab manager, and not even for all these different reasons, for hierarchy, for gender, for, I don't want to, this is the person who's writing my letter of recommendation and I need them for my grant. How can I challenge what they've just said? And so sometimes we don't say what we really think. Sometimes what one person is saying doesn't actually, the same exact term can mean something really different to another discipline or a different field. And that can be very challenging as well as you miscommunicate. So I have 4 different principles of communication that I'm going to talk to you about that come from a study that I did. And these 4 principles, perspective seeking, promotive voice, team reflection, and managing connections, are the kinds of norms that I've spent time teaching and training teams around the country. Let me see if I can. So essentially what I did, I conducted a research study, and it was at a large medical research university that was having a call for proposals for interdisciplinary team science. And it was a time where this institution was having a hiring freeze and was general reduction in federal funding. So the idea was, could they find promising areas of research inside of the medical school? And so from this call convened about 65 different interdisciplinary teams. And they engaged in a process of a competition for about 9 months. And so I sat in these meetings and observed these teams engaging. I looked at how PIs conducted meetings, etc., and was able to relate what I saw qualitatively along with some survey data and connect that to actual performance outcomes. So the training that I developed is something that's coming from this body of data. So when I train teams, I use that data. What's important for you to know is that this was an NSF-funded study in which I have now had about 8 different medical research institutions from Stanford, Northwestern, UCI, VCU, number of different medical schools where I've trained teams at each of these different sites, and they've received either the communication training or a control condition. And I've tracked the performance of these teams working together over time. So we have a traditional pre-post study design where I have data looking at their processes before the training and after the training. All of this to say what you're about to hear in the next little bit is not just because I think so. It's all rooted in an empirical study of research faculty in a medical school. And what I'm going to talk about today is a condition of the communication compared to the control. When we look at, well, what does it mean to have improved their communication? We looked at team effectiveness. We looked at the quality of their ideas that were generated, how much their ideas were integrating the different perspectives of people around the table, and how novel their ideas were. Essentially, we see that when they engage in particular those 4 principles of communication, we see that people are listening to each other more, they're generating more ideas, and so much of it has to do with the fact that they have created conditions to really think about what other people are saying, build on those ideas, and generate something new. The way that I've trained teams, and I'll show you, we'll go through one vignette here, is as follows. I'm going to show 2 vignettes. One is stylized in a form that's not so positive, and one is a positive example of the vignette. So I'm going to read one of them for you. Leader here, let me just take a few minutes here. We, the clinical trials core team, have a good idea of where the trials will go, as we've been thinking about this for a long time. We'd like to figure out more about the variation in response and are considering a few ways to do so. We know that there are alcohol-preferring and non-preferring mice. We want to keep exploring if there are clear differences in stimulant responsivity in other strains. We want to move to rats. So here you can see from the dialogue that went on, member 1 says, well, testing with rats is quite time-consuming. Perhaps in mice it would be the easiest. There's a big literature on that for cocaine, amphetamines, alcohol, etc. And very quickly, right, the leader says, yeah, we're aware. Not all of our ideas will be so time-consuming. For instance, we're going to look at behavioral responses and as a first discriminator. Anyhow, let's continue moving on. And then they end with this. We'll write up our ideas, and if anybody has any new ideas or questions, let me know. I'll email you some information, right? So very quickly in this particular vignette, there's a PI who's got an idea. Somebody says, well, I have another idea, or what about something different? And the conversation is closed, right? Not only that, but it's, hey, let's not use our face-to-face time to brainstorm, right? Never mind the fact that in the room are years and years of education, but quickly dialogue is going to go via email. And so in this other, which I won't go through reading it, but I just want to give you a sense of how this works. Here's another PI. And what's really nice about this PI is they start off this meeting, and these meetings, by the way, have representation from clinical research faculty, basic research faculty, geneticists. None of these teams are just one siloed all by themselves. But he says, let me take a few minutes here. We have a good idea how the clinical trials will go. But I think the strengths that we have here, meaning here in this room right now, are the very basic science people and the genetics people. So I would focus us on going backwards in terms of thinking about questions like, how does this treatment really work? What are the mechanisms, etc. And so then there's all kinds of conversation that follows about what they can do. And in this particular team, they actually had a clinical trial that was showing a drug that was working for addiction, right? And instead they're going, why is the drug working? And they need to go back from the treatment to figure out what is it on a basic level that's causing this effect. But the way this PI has opened up the conversation is something that I'll show you in a second, which is essentially to give people who are in the room a sense of who's in the room. How many of you have attended a meeting? You walk in and you don't know everyone there. Raise your hand if you've been somewhere where you're sitting somewhere and you're starting to get to work, but you don't exactly know everyone that's sitting around the table. Has that ever happened to you? Yes. So a very simple first move is to indicate, we have some clinical research faculty here. We have a geneticist in the room. By the way, so-and-so is doing some fantastic imaging work, right? And you just give everybody a little bit of a mental map of what expertise is available to us. You state the problem, right? And then you start to open up the discussion. This particular PI, I'm I'm certain, had the same exact research idea as the one in the previous vignette. But instead of saying, hey, I have an idea, here team, here it is, respond to it, challenge it, and give me your feedback, is instead realizing that the wisdom doesn't come from them alone, but from saying, hey, let me pose this problem to the collective, and let's see what comes from the group. Right there is something really interesting about your own ego as communicators in science. You've worked years and years and years to gain the expertise that allows you to be a professor here, or a clinical research faculty, or a clinical faculty here at Mount Sinai. And now I'm saying, when you facilitate in the team, lead from a place that is not about hierarchy, that is not about boosting your own ego, but about facilitating and bringing out the best in the people you work with. Does that make sense? Right? And it's very easy to want to come in and say, I have this idea, I have this plan, but instead to say, what do we want to do? And how can I facilitate the process? It's not to say that these leaders don't have, but let me really quickly show you here. So this is the same, this is the actual text, by the way, from this team. The other one is a stylized negative version. But take a look at how this conversation goes. Different people keep coming into the conversation. It ends up being a very rich dialogue. When you're sitting in the room, it's the closest that I can say that it comes to what you might call team flow, where you're in a meeting going, oh, this is interesting. I never thought about that. I never knew that there was that tool. Oh, we can connect this technique with what you've been doing. Wonderful, right? And what I challenge you is to say, how can you use your meeting time, your face-to-face time, to let it be, in essence, a playground, right? Instead of it being, oh, I have this meeting to go to. What if you facilitated meetings where people were learning and really building on one another's ideas? And to the point of inclusion and managing implicit biases, the minute you're running a meeting like this, it indicates to your team, I think your ideas matter, regardless of race, gender, rank, right? And I'll tell you something, the minute a PI demonstrates that they want to listen, they're asking questions of others, it says to the team, I want to hear what you have to say, right? It's not a top-down kind of thing. So I have the first principle, right, is this perspective seeking to understand what other people in the team think, how they feel about an idea, etc. And realizing that people have different viewpoints. So you can facilitate this by floating a trial balloon. What if we did this? Playing devil's advocate, asking clarifying questions, etc. Inquiring about what other people know. In particular, I had in one of the teams that I was on, they had a mathematician who was able to model, airflow through the lung. And you would think, why is a mathematician in the room with medical scientists, right? So if you as a PI have invited somebody who is from your network, who you know their expertise is the missing piece, and I'll tell you now, right, we know that it's increasingly the case that we need to be talking to our computer scientists, machine learning colleagues. If they're in the room and nobody knows how they are, that's your chance to say, hey, Layla, you've been working on that really neat query and algorithm to figure out how to use the data from, I'm not sure what your medical record program is here, but I know you've been doing something neat with such and such. Can you talk to the team about how we could use that data? And that's how you bring their expertise into the room. So what we find is when we see more of this open-ended questions, humble inquiry, curiosity about what other people know, completely sets the trajectory of a team in a different way. Just like the norm for the digits, it's like opening up your meeting with saying, let's see what people know and bring the most out of a team, versus narrowing the direction of the conversation. So these are just some of the facilitators and inhibitors that we saw related to perspective seeking. Now, what I want to bring up is what is the response to such a way of opening up and facilitating a dialogue. And it's people sharing what they know, which is the most gracious thing you can do, is let people bring their best self to work. A recent poll suggested that it was a Gallup poll, right? So this is millions of employees, say that only 20% of the workforce feels that they actually bring their best selves and their talents into the job, right? And in a way, you might even ask yourself, how does this help facilitate allowing people to bring up their own ideas? And so again, you can bring up expertise by saying, oh, I have this, idea about this project we've been working on, which is what we all think about, especially if it's something that's original, that it's disciplinary based, right? When you're brought into this kind of team that's interprofessional, whether on the clinical side or interdisciplinary on the research side, you're there because of your specialized knowledge. But let me highlight something. What really made these teams work was when people built on one another's ideas. But again, we've been in such an ego norm of how can I show I'm the smartest, rather than what are the complementarities between what I know and what you know and what could be generated. But that means setting norms that say this is valued in this setting. So again, when we see this building on of ideas, there's a huge difference. When original ideas are cut off very quickly, that's when we see a reduction. Maybe about a year or two ago, I led this seminar up at UC Davis. It was a group looking at autism. And there was a woman who had been a pediatric person who'd been doing a lot of really interesting work. And she started talking about some of the genetic component of her work. And there was a geneticist in the room who essentially was like, we haven't used that genetic technique for a really long time. He was a very cutting edge geneticist. And it was a subtle comment, but do you think we heard from this woman who's actually a strong contributor to the field? Do you think we heard from her again during this workshop? No, she was totally embarrassed, right? And so sometimes, and those are these little microaggressions that when you're thinking about team communication, you go, oh, well, everyone's just talking. But that's the moment that you do interject and say, oh, okay, I thank you for sharing how the field has advanced, but how can we think about the promising findings she is getting with this other technique and build that in, or can we enhance their work, right? But there are these times when somebody says essentially, I can't believe you're still it's judgmental. I can't believe you're still doing that, or what, So there are tiny moments in communication that completely derail participation. So let me show you two more really quickly. This is team reflection, which is, again, like I talked about with that PI before. It's like a chef getting ready to cook, right? If you don't know what ingredients you have at your disposal as a team, we call it technically transactive memory, you don't know what to innovate from or what solutions you could potentially what solutions you could potentially get to. And so one of the very first things at every single meeting, if you can, is a quick, it doesn't have to be introductions every single time, but letting people know who's in the room, what are we here to do, what's the aim of this particular meeting. It takes 10 seconds to set that and to ask, are there any other open meeting items we need to talk about? If you are running a lab, right, the simple norm of saying, let's do a quick paper check. What are the statuses on what's going on? It's a good opportunity to figure out things happen in people's lives, to figure out, can you actually meet the deadline, and do we need to get somebody to help you? But here's what really came up from this data. I'll fast forward here. So as you team reflection, how are you doing on who's doing what deadlines do you have, a quick check on communication. But here's something that we found. If you have, and I hope you have this every year, at least every 6 months, where are we going right now, especially if you're running a research lab? What ideas, what should we be working on? And fortunately now, after having worked with almost 120 teams across all those different medical schools around the country, most research faculty and clinical research faculty say, you know where I get my ideas? I have to go to my annual conference, have a glass of wine in my hand, run into my colleague who works in the same department as me, and at a meeting, we start chatting about what we should do next. It's not at work. Why? Because we're all running a million directions, right? And so what I say is stop and actually have a meeting. Maybe it's an hour and a half, twice a year. That's what's the next big question we should be asking in our lab, or what's the next clinical thing we should do? What's an improvement we could make? And in that meeting, as people are generating ideas, the worst thing that can happen, and I call it the 405 because that's the freeway that I live in. The 405 of creativity, where the traffic is, let's say somebody says, oh, we're working on pediatric obesity, and somebody says, oh, you know what, let's game it. Maybe we can come up with a new game on the iPad or the iPhone and think about how we could create and somebody says, how much is that going to cost? Do we have an engineer that can do that? Come come on, really, and it gets to this reflection about how much is it feasibility, cost, etc. If you were in a Fortune 500 company like IDEO or Google or, I don't even, Apple, you think they say take the first wacky idea and say, come on, that's, no way, we can't do that. But we do it very quickly because we work off of grant money and soft money. But every once in a while you can say, okay, let's talk about that. And then from that, holding on to that idea and letting a couple other people say, well, maybe we can't do that, but I was thinking, what about this other simple game? Or what about a chat room? And all of a sudden, an idea that seems crazy, and you stick with it and build upon it and let it grow a little bit, builds momentum. And so in the most creative teams, there was an idea shared, building on it, critiquing it, thinking about it, and then they'd move, somebody else would say, oh, that reminds me of so-and-so's work. Idea number 2 comes up. But if it's just the case where something is brought up and it's not really flushed out, discussed, you move on to the next thing because it can't possibly be, or whatever it might be, that's where we get to the 4 or 5 of creativity. And there are people in your meetings, the lab manager, the administrator, who their orientation, just from the minute of birth, is how do we get things done, what's the plan, what's the cost. You might even say, this is going to be a hard meeting for you. I'm going to need you just to sort of stay quiet and take notes, even if you think you want to know the how and how much and et cetera, right? You can even keep a whiteboard going with all those other questions. And let the dialogue be creative. Again, very few times at work, despite our education, do we actually walk into the meeting and go, wow, that's why I got a PhD. That was a creative, fun meeting. And I'm saying protect that by by having a couple of these different kinds of conversations. So I'm going to just move past this particular vignette, but I want to show you the last principle here, which is managing connections. And in this managing connections, this is as simple as referring to other people in a meeting and saying, look, we're working on this, but I know so-and-so does this work that could really connect us to you. Or I know a biostatistician that would be perfect for this domain, and bringing them in. And so it's building building interpersonal connections among people, leveraging resources to the best of your ability, and bringing individuals into the team. I do another training that's more about mapping and building and designing a research project, and that's a really good opportunity to say, okay, and I'd like to think about it in the following terms. Asking yourself the question, are we a resource for success? At a team at UCLA who submitted a grant, didn't get a great score, came to do my exercise, and in the exercise, we realized that they had forgotten a particular specialty that they should have put on, they should have provided a biosketch and said this is what they're going to do on the team. And that's why they had gotten dinged in their score, because some of the team, they were essentially like, hey, you're the team to do this, but you're missing this expert. So we don't think you can pull it off, right? So sometimes when you're building connections, you might come together around some really neat idea and realize, hey, we're good, but we're missing a neuroscientist. We're missing a pediatrician. And so thinking about how you get those connections is really critical. So to summarize, I want to show you a chart. So we took all the frequency of these different principles across a number of different teams. Remember, this is not quantitative, it's qualitative, and associating it with the outcome. And what we find is that a lot of the different teams were engaging in open questions. The difference was the extent to which teams focused on the how much, when will we get this done, do we have the person that can do this, do we have a fridge to keep those samples, kind of you're going too soon to the how will this plan become implemented, rather than staying in a conversation for a little longer. And again, the consequence, right, is that more people, almost 70% of a meeting becomes sharing of expertise, building on one another's ideas, having a fruitful conversation where a lot of people are included. I can't tell you, it was one of the meetings we had was looking at a cochlear implant. And in that, right, there's a lot of times dizziness that comes with it. There was a rehabilitation therapist in the room who had a different take on the exact same phenomena that the team was looking at. But the conversation literally looked like 3 men, all specialists, surgeons, and then other people related to the disease. And what I'm saying to you is that's not an inclusive work team. The team should be saying, okay, we have this problem. What perspectives do all of these people have? And unfortunately, there are some gender differences in who's going to do rehabilitation, therapy, on who's going to be a nurse, on who's. And the question is, what kind of solution do we get to if we involve everyone and we really listen in a mindful way? And I get it. Everybody has these deadlines. Everybody's got to get the grant in next week. But can you build in systems such that this becomes a little bit more smooth? And I think the answer is yes, and my data suggests that the answer is yes. So if you say, well, longitudinally, what does a really great meeting look like? It starts out with the PR saying, welcome, everybody. Today we're going to talk about this part of our project. I brought you all in here for a number of reasons, because you bring in this expertise, that expertise, and this expertise. Let's start by talking about this potential question or problem. Then somebody's first idea comes up, they talk about it, somebody says, well, come on, really, is that how we should go? What about this alternative? There's a little bit of banter about it. Then maybe this says, well, you know, you've been working on that really nice project, you want to tell everybody about it. There's idea number 2. Same thing, you dive deep, you have a conversation about it. Your brain, you're discussing. And then maybe in one meeting, you talk about 2 to 3 topics in depth, right? But it's in depth. So by the time everybody leaves, you're wrapping up going, great, we have some really interesting possibilities. Where could we go from here? You have a paper on some research on conflict management that you might be interested in, and other topics. Feel free to write me and I can send you some of that reading if interested. Lastly, we do have an annual conference called the Science of Team Science. It will be held this year at Michigan State. If you or any of your colleagues are interested in just coming to learn more about teaming. The last thing is that the National Academies of Science produced a report on team science. It is the 3rd most high downloaded publication that they've ever produced, meaning everyone wants to know about how to team. It's also very good. So feel free to continue. You have the solution space down if you'd like to read them. But I hope that you can do your best to bring these principles even into your work today. So thanks so much. It was a real pleasure to spend the morning with all of you.